So we've already talked a little bit about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, but let me remind you of just the bare details. In March of 1911, there was a factory on the 9th floor of a building in New York City called the Triangle Building. In that building, they had a large number of people, about 500 people on one floor, making what were called shirtwaists. Shirtwaists are dresses for women, where the top from the waist up looks like a man's shirt, and then there's a skirt below, but it's a one-piece outfit. And the conditions of work for these immigrant women, mostly Italians and Jews, were really abominable. They were locked in once they got to work in the early morning, and they were not permitted to leave until about 10 or 12 hours later. They were also paid based on piecework arrangements. Now, piecework means that you get paid depending on how many pieces of clothing you actually sew. So there was a priority on working fast and working hard and not taking any breaks. They were not permitted to go to the bathroom. They had no lunchtime. They ate while they sewed. It was very bad. And of course, it was hot during the summer and cold during the winter because there was, well, of course, no air conditioning, but there was no heating either. On March 25th, somehow something caught fire. Now, it's very easy to understand how that could happen because there was all kinds of clothing dust lying around on the floor, and somehow that got ignited. 146 women died, and it was a great tragedy. This tragedy could have been prevented if the doors had been open, but many women were burned to death. Some leaped out of windows because they thought that was the only way out. And of course, the fire department ladders and hoses could not reach that high. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was the turning point in labor relations in New York City, and consequently elsewhere in the United States as well. Now, there had been some labor unrest in the immediately preceding years. In 1909, there was an uprising of 20,000 shirt and cloak makers, but there were few results. And earlier in 1910, there were about 50,000 cloak makers, maybe 60,000, who went on strike. The protocols of peace that were negotiated between the managers and the workers, the owners and the people who worked there, were negotiated by Louis Brandeis, who subsequently became a justice of the Supreme Court. It provided for a structural process of negotiating and arbitrating disputes. Unfortunately, that was never enforced, and things pretty much went back to the status quo ante, how it was before. There was also created a joint board of sanitary control, and notice the archaic verbiage there in 1910. That was supposed to provide some safeguard for the working conditions. Now, Triangle Company had never signed on to any of these embryonic reforms. This was really unfettered and unrestricted capitalism at its worst. They believed they had the right to exploit workers, to use them to the extent that they could. There were so many poor people looking for jobs that they thought the workers had no way of protesting, and that if they didn't like what they were doing, they could go somewhere else, and we could always find new people. It was that easy. The police almost always backed the employers, including using violence to break up strikes, arresting strikers, and imprisoning them against any reasonable cause. Now, Of course, Jews, like other immigrants, were spread pretty much throughout the working force in New York City, except in construction work. That was not an area they worked in. But because of the employment arrangements in Europe, where tailoring and factory work was the common thing that Jews did, Jews and other immigrants like them were concentrated in the needle trades. They worked primarily in clothing. This era of the early decades of the 20th century is often called the progressive era in American history. And it was a time when people were beginning to question unregulated economic development. There were significant movements to improve the conditions of work. And you have a president named Theodore Roosevelt, who is actually one of the leaders of this movement. There were protests all over about bad working conditions and the social ills and the political unrest. It moved into the middle and upper middle class, and even the upper class became concerned with this, and they began to question the rights of the so-called robber barons and other exploiters in America. It was that time when there were antitrust agreements reached in Congress and laws passed to limit the growth of industrial corporations and their control over certain industries. It was a time also of Protestant activism, and you have the growth of the Prohibition movement. Now, part of that temperance movement was to improve the lot of workers, because the assumption was that many of these people, especially the immigrants, were hurting themselves by drinking too much. And if they could be stopped from drinking, then they would be better workers. There was an example in England, which I digress to report to you, in the Cadbury Chocolate Company, of all places. Cadbury was founded in Birmingham, England, in the early part of the 19th century. And by the middle of the century, the sons of the original founder, Richard and George Cadbury, had taken over the company. They were Quakers, and they believed in temperance, but they also believed in hard work and fairness. And Richard Cadbury, in 1876, began to move his company out of the slums of English cities, out of Birmingham. They founded a place about 4 miles out of the city and began to construct a model city. And by 1893, they had built 143 cottages for workers. And the deal was very simple. We will give you very cheap rent, and we will give you all the chocolate you can consume. Chocolate for your drinks, for your kids, whatever, if you stop drinking gin. If you stay sober. If you get drunk, you won't be able to live here. You'll be fired. And so it was a social experiment to help the workers stay sober, make better profits, and have better living conditions at the same time. Everybody wins. Those kinds of experiments were well known to the Americans during this time. And so the women's temperance movement, the WCTU, as it was called, and the Women's Trade Union League, which was founded in 1903, were efforts by the nobility of the Protestant world and general of the American world to help workers improve their lots. Unfortunately, there was very little change until after the fire in 1911. Then, the New York Labor Code was a series of 36 bills passed by the Democrats in the state legislature after a long period of Republican obstructionism. The Republicans, of course, in those days were uniquely the representatives of the upper managerial and ownership class. Democrats were the working people, and they finally got enough votes to pass these bills to change the conditions of labor. They also created something called the Fire Safety and Prevention Board, which helped. There was slow change over even the next decade, but the groundwork had been laid. It really remained for the election of 1928, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected governor of New York State. He tackled the corrupt New York political machine that had stymied progress, and Roosevelt made it his goal to improve conditions all the way around, but also to break the back of the Tammany machine. He was then elected president in 1932, and he brought some of his staff from New York State down to Washington with him. Two people in particular deserve to be noticed. One was a woman who was a very important person named Frances Perkins. She was the Secretary of Labor under the early Roosevelt administration. She was instrumental in passing some significant minimum wage laws, the first ones ever done, and creating the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put people to work in public projects during the Depression. The other person of note was a man named Harold Ickes, that's I-C-K-E-S, and he was the Secretary of the Interior. He was known by the nickname of Honest Harold. He created the Public Works Administration, which sponsored large projects of public construction. He created the National Park System as we know it today, and actually hired somebody that you probably heard of, the photographer Ansel Adams, who took some of the most wonderful pictures, especially of Yosemite Park. And he was a very vehement advocate of civil rights and civil liberties. He had been a leader of the NAACP in Chicago. And in 1939, in April, the great mezzo-soprano Marian Anderson, a black opera singer, was scheduled to sing at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they said no black person, no Negro, would sing on their stage. So Ickes arranged for Marian Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, and you can go on YouTube and hear her singing at that concert. It was attended by tens and tens of thousands of people, and it was a major statement similar to what Martin Luther King Jr. did when he made his I Have a Dream speech from the same site. He also ended segregation in all facilities owned by the Department of the Interior. Now, I say this because these were people of considerable consequence who had the interests of American workers at heart. Jews in America also wanted to improve conditions. Now, in Russia, where many of them had come from, oppression had been brutal. We've talked about that. And frankly, any alternative to Tsarist oppression would have been preferable. So Jews were often in protest movements. Social change movements like Bundism, socialism, communism, anarchism, nihilism, Zionism, All of these were efforts to change the system, to improve their conditions of life. There were religious change movements as well. On the one hand, there was atheism, and on the other hand, there was Hasidism. Hasids are ultra-pious Orthodox Jews, and their point of view was, we will embrace religion in a total way, immerse ourselves in it, and let the rest of the world go by as it wants to. And emigration, of course, both to the promised land of Zion, Palestine, and to all other parts of the world. Jews had suffered disproportionately in Europe, and so they were found disproportionately in some of these movements. And so the immigrants who came to America were already predisposed to making changes. This was a selected group of people who already believed that they needed to make a better life for themselves and for others. Jewish immigrants to America espoused change movements, and they brought those with them to America. But America was different. America was not hospitable to really revolutionary change movements. Yes, there was a Communist Party, the IWW, and there were other kinds of radical movements. Sacco and Vanzetti, for example, were representatives of a radical movement that came from Italy. But generally speaking, Jews who came to America wanted change that would improve their lot without necessarily reducing the conditions of life for anybody else. They wanted a piece of the pie. They wanted what all other Americans wanted: better conditions, better housing, better food, better schooling, better life for themselves, and security. The early labor unions were sometimes affected by these radical ideologies that they brought with them. But by 1923, everybody had seen what happened in Russia and after the Russian Revolution, and the influence of the communists in American labor declined very rapidly. They fell out of favor. There was a Jewish labor leader who was very influential. His name was David Dubinsky. Dubinsky had been born in Poland as the son of radical socialists, and he was imprisoned in Siberia as a young man, but he escaped in 1911 and fled to the United States. And he was the president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union from 1932 to 1966. That's a long time to be president of anything, but 34 years is an amazing run for anybody. His statement was that he wanted middle-class ambitions for lower-class workers rather than ideology. He simply wanted to make sure that the people who belonged to his union would have more money, more safety, more security, better jobs, year after year after year, and that's what he did accomplish. Now, his model was a man who ran for president 5 times, I think, Eugene V. Debs. And Debs never made it very far. America was not a country that espoused ideology. We were very pragmatic. We just wanted results. The other person that you ought to know about is a man named Meyer London. Meyer London was born in Lithuania in 1871 and died in New York in 1926. He was raised in a family of radical intellectuals, and he came to New York at age 19 in 1890. He went to law school at New York University, and specialized in civil rights and labor law. He was only one of two socialists who were elected to Congress. He represented the Lower East Side of New York, which of course was a very Jewish area. He was elected in 1914, turned out of office in 1918, re-elected in 1920. One of the things that made him unpopular was that during World War I he was a pacifist, and he supported the war effort and Woodrow Wilson, but he really was against war in general. He was also a very early Zionist. The other man who was elected was a man named Victor Berger from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he had multiple terms and was also a controversial person in Congress. When Meyer London died in 1926, 500,000 people in New York turned out to escort him to the cemetery. That's how popular he was. So what we want to do is also notice that London, even though he was a socialist, even though he was unpopular in certain circles, was recognized as a significant person in American life. During World War II, a small cargo ship was named the Meyer London. Unfortunately, on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic and through the Mediterranean, it was torpedoed by a German submarine off of Libya and sank. Fortunately, nobody was killed or injured. They were rescued by a British warship, but that was the end of the Meyer London ship. There is a school called PS2 in New York. It is the Meyer London School, and it's also located on the Lower East Side of New York. Jews in general, in the labor movement, had the effect of leading the charge for better conditions. And even though labor unions are suffering somewhat today, it is very clear that in their day, they had a major impact for good among American Jewish workers and American workers in general.